You can start a long ways back, right? You can start with the agricultural revolution when we started eating all these grains and, 12,000 years ago. And, Egyptians had a lot of problems. Actually, we think of them as having such a healthy diet. And they're like, oh, they didn't have processed foods back then. They didn't, why did they? We found that they had heart disease and atherosclerosis and they were overweight. And it's because of their high grain diets.
Hey guys, today our guest is Brian Sanders. Brian Sanders is the filmmaker behind the feature length documentary Food Lies, which aims to bring out the truth that we all need to hear to become a healthy human being. He's also the host of the Peak Human podcast, which is an ad free audio series with leading experts on nutrition. He's also a health coach and is the co founder of health media and technology company Sapien. Coming from a technical background, Brian have a clear and precise way to distill nutrition information in a unique way that many people will understand. I am so happy to invite Brian Sanders to the show. Hey Brian, thanks for coming to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Brian, before we go into the questions, where can people connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at food.lies. That's my main thing. But any platform, if you just search for Food Lies, I'll be there. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Brian, can you share something about your documentary before we go into the real questions?
Sure, yeah. It's been about 2.5 years I've been creating it, and I've been studying this stuff for 6 years now, and it kind of made it my life. And so it's just my life's goal to put this all into one film and let people know, all the stuff that I've learned because nutrition stuff is so complicated, right? You hear opposite things. Everywhere you go, it's the opposite things. One person says plant-based, person says meat-based, and it doesn't really make sense, right, to a lot of people. So my goal is to distill it down into something that makes sense and anyone can understand and put it in a film and you could just watch it and maybe it's an hour 45 minutes and it's all packed in there and at the end you'll just get it. You'll get it and you'll know what to do.
Thanks, Brian. Brian, how did you discover these food lies that are across the world?
Wow. Well, the main thing is my parents got sick. And so we followed the dietary guidelines my whole life, right? So I grew up, we made our own food every day. We weren't going to McDonald's all the time. We were, not like other Americans. Some Americans just go to McDonald's all the time or whatever fast food. We were making our own food, following the guidelines. And then they just gradually got sicker and sicker, right? It's this chronic disease and you just get less and less health as you age, and they both, had major health issues, and it woke me up. And so I was doing the same thing, right? I was eating the standard diet and low fat and all the healthy whole grains they say, and I was not doing well. Like I was just getting heavier each year and getting sick all the time and having all these conditions. But yeah, I finally got into this world. Mark Sisson was a big influence. If people know him, he wrote a great book called The Primal Blueprint, and it kind of spelled out a lot of this stuff. And I just started doing it, and I quickly changed my life. Sounds like you have too, where I quickly, within a matter of months, felt amazing, trimmed down, just so many things happened. So I realized that so much of what we knew was wrong.
Brian, how did people start to bought these food lies? Like, how did it start?
So, I mean, the story, we're going to tell the whole story in the film, but you can start a long ways back, right? You can start with the agricultural revolution when we started eating all these grains and, 12,000 years ago. And, Egyptians had a lot of problems. Actually, we think of them as having such a healthy diet. And they're like, oh, they didn't have processed foods back then. They didn't, why did they? We found that they had heart disease and atherosclerosis and they were overweight. And it's because of their high grain diets. But then it really started probably 150 years ago when there's this kind of religious influence that came about. And it's called the Seventh-day Adventists. And there's a whole story here about where these religious people started thinking that meat was unclean and that it was unhealthy for people and it wasn't pure. And to be pure for God, you needed to, not eat meat, and it made men violent. They thought made men violent. So there's a whole story here that I'm actually just going through now in the film and looking at some of the best quotes we have from the interviews and talking about even it may even have had to do with something about the Americans moving to the city. So it was in the late 1800s, and you go from the farms where you're getting fresh meat and all the good foods, and then now that we're in the cities, and maybe this meat was spoiled or it wasn't as fresh or you couldn't get it, and we didn't have refrigeration. So, maybe it did start making people sick. So people just started having this negative thought of meat. And ever since, there's been each decade, there's this new wave of people demonizing meat, right? Then it goes into the 1940s and 50s, and we had President Eisenhower who had a heart attack. So our president was like, oh my God, what's going on? There was this big sort of epidemic, but it was also when everyone was smoking and when we started eating processed foods and when we started, doing so many other unhealthy habits and all these vegetable oils came into the picture. And so then, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into the entire story, but there's like a whole Ansel Keys and there's a McGovern report. There was kind of these two ideas of, one guy, Ansel Keys, thought it was saturated fat was a problem. And then we have another guy, John Yudkin, who is a British guy who's saying, no, it's sugar. It's all the sugar and flour. But, basically we did some bad science. We didn't have all the technology to do good science. We were limited back then. We're talking about the 1950s. So I like this one. We did some tests on rabbits where we gave them a high saturated fat diet with a lot of cholesterol, and then they got messed up. And it's obvious that that would happen because rabbits are supposed to eat grass and leaves and vegetables. They're not supposed to eat animal foods and cholesterol. So of course they had problems. So we kind of had these bad ideas. So it kind of makes sense, right? And we kind of were led astray. And then it took us up until now to really figure out the consequences of this.
Brian, what is the sapien diet?
Okay, so Sapien diet is kind of what I've found to be the best way for humans to eat, and it's not one diet, right? It's a framework, right? It's a way of eating that you can adapt to what you like or the environment you live in. There's northern climates, there's more closer to the equator, there's different foods available. But the simple thing is that you don't is what you avoid, right? So what I found is the most all good diets avoid the worst three things, which I think are the sugars, refined grains, and vegetable oils. So Weston A. Price as a doctor, a dentist actually, who went around the world and found this out almost 100 years ago. And he found that all the healthiest cultures didn't have these three things in their diet. And as soon as they came into their diet, their health deteriorated very quickly. So it's very interesting and this was all in the 1930s, and a lot of these native living people were still, living their native lifestyle, and they weren't connected with Western culture, and they were very healthy. And then as soon as if they lived next to a port town and they were doing trade, and they would get a bunch of flour and oil and sugar, stuff like that was easy to transport and had a long shelf life, then they started incorporating their diet and they got very healthy, very sick, very quickly. So the main thing about a sapien diet is you avoid those three things, right? And then it's also about embracing animal foods and eating whole foods. And just that it's simple. It's like, and I like to be fat adapted, as I say, right? People know the keto diet. It's basically you run fat metabolism instead of glucose. And so you don't have to on a sapien diet. You can, there's all different ways to do it, but I like to embrace fat. I like to be in ketosis from time to time. I like to avoid carbs as much as possible. But basically, yeah, it's just a way that anyone, it even can be pescatarian, right? Some people are pescatarian. They want to eat fish and vegetables and all that stuff. That's fine with me. I don't know if it's my ideal thing, or maybe it's not ideal in general, but people can do fine on it. They can be perfectly healthy if they, do it correctly and are eating whole foods.
Brian, many people believe that our ancestors lived a short life and question why should we follow their diet?
Mm, That's a good question too, and I've been looking into a lot of that lately for the film because the beginning of the film goes over the evolution story. It's like, how did we get here? What did we eat? What does this all tell us, right? And what I found, and I'm finding some good papers on it, is that we okay, the average lifespan is an average, right? So when people say, "Oh, we died at 35," that doesn't mean we died at 35. That means the average age of death was 35, which means there was tons and tons of kids dying in birth. There was tons of toddlers dying. This is very harsh environments. Like not many people made it into their teens even, right? So it's like the average is brought down, but the mode of age of death, right? That means what age did the most people die at? And we can look at modern hunter-gatherer people who live the same, and that's between 70 and 80 for many of these tribes we study, right? So we look at the Hadza or some other, tribes in Africa, and we look, and they don't even have access to healthcare. So part of the story is that people died of different things. So up until all our modern society, people died of accidents, of you get there's viral infections, infectious diseases, or accidents, or other things that we can prevent now, right? And they didn't die of chronic disease, right? So that all the chronic diseases that we're dying of that are all preventable and all related to diet and lifestyle are what we're dying of. So it's completely different. So now we have medical systems that can treat the simple things that our ancestors died of. So I'm looking into all of the data that I can find on how long people lived back then, and there's unfortunately not that much good data, but we know that human beings can easily live into their 70s and 80s. Like that is absolutely we know that happened. We just don't know how common it is, but based on newer tribes and peoples that we study, we can see that it's perfectly happens a lot.
Brian, can you please debunk the argument that cows are mainly responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so that's really coming to light nowadays, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, because I just posted a study that it was some big agency. It was some it wasn't like some weird little people. It was the Energy Association, and we're showing how low the CO2 emissions are. The emissions are at all-time low. The CO2 is all-time low, and this is what people were saying that was attributed to animal agriculture, and like the methane, and then methane turns into CO2. So I mean, we should be having all-time. I mean, we shouldn't be having these all-time lows if it was the animals, because the animals are being eaten just the same, if not more. People supermarkets are selling out of meat across the world because people know how valuable it is and they want it. But what it's gone down, the real problem is the fossil fuel use. It's transportation. It's all the big industry. And so since that's all been going down lately, we can see how low all these emissions are now. But basically, there's so much to the story. But I guess a easy way to explain it with the cows is that when cows are in grass, they're in this harmonious cycle. Like this is how animals have been living for all of history. There's been, millions and tens of millions of buffalo that would roam the plains of North America, right? And they were not ruining the environment. They were living. There's a natural cycle where they eat grass and they produce methane through burps mostly, and then that methane goes up in the atmosphere, but then it comes back down because it's all in a cycle. Nature works in cycles, right? So that the grass that they eat absorbs CO2, right? It's like how it works. People know the sunlight and the CO2, it's like part of this system. So you can imagine this being a circle. It's a loop, right? So the cows and the burps, and then it comes back down, it goes in the grass, and the grass sequesters carbon. That's how grass and soil work. But then you can think of a one-way street with all the fossil fuels where we're getting them out of the ground. So this is stuff that's been buried away, and then we're pulling it out and burning it. Right? This is a one-way street, right? It's all coming up and building up in the atmosphere. So it's very obvious if you just think about it in the really basic level. But then we could get into a million other little things about land use and this and that, and how much CO2 and how many emissions there are just from, growing plants, right? If we're growing fields and fields of monocropped plants, it is a huge problem. So mainly just know that there needs to be some energy or some emissions and some sort of toll on the environment to grow any food. So what we want is to eat high quality nutrition from animals that humans do better with, and they actually are very efficient and provide us with good protein. So we should eat animals.
Thanks, Brian. Brian, many people say that fruits and vegetables are high in nutrients and vitamins, but can you say why we can't use them?
Yeah, I used to think this. And I used to, everyone says, oh, fruit, it's so amazing. Fruit specifically, if you look at fruit, I have some of these charts and we'll show them in the film, the fruit is basically just a bunch of sugar and maybe a few tiny bits of vitamin C. And like if you look at the numbers, I wish I had it in front of me. I could show it is very small numbers. If you just side by side comparisons just by what is in it, it's very, very small compared to any animal food that has tons of these vitamins and minerals. And then there's a whole nother story about the bioavailability of those. So even so, just from the get-go, animal foods all have way more. And then we talk about, can your body use it? And so the bioavailability from animal foods is far greater because we're animals. This is how humans are mostly omnivores. Some would say mostly carnivores, and we have evolved for millions of years to eat this food. And we are not monkeys. We're not, hippopotamus. We are not a rabbit. We're not meant to sit here and eat a bunch of grass and leaves. That's not how our bodies work. Our digestive systems have changed. We don't have the long, large intestine and the cecum that ferments all these plants. And everyone knows the cows have the four stomachs, and they do their fermentation of these plant foods. We don't have that. So we can't derive all this nutrition from the plant foods like some other animals can do. And then also plant foods have something called anti-nutrients. So they have these things, there's phytates and phytic acid and oxalates and lectins, and people have heard of gluten and grain, and all these things are things that most of them are things that are the plant is trying to protect themselves, right? So the plant, and I'm sure Sally Norton talked about this type of stuff, where you don't, these actually bind with some of the minerals. So they block the absorption of some of these minerals and vitamins, so you don't get as much. So just know even what's on the labels and you see on the data showing what's in that, you may not be getting all of those vitamins and minerals. But with animal foods, you're getting a far greater proportion.
Brian, why should we get serious about vitamin D?
Oh yeah, I'm really big on vitamin D these days with this coronavirus, and I've been following it the whole time. I've been learning about vitamin D for years now, and I used to think it was just nothing. It's just like, oh, whatever, it's just like another vitamin. Vitamin D is a cholesterol. It's a hormone. It's a very, very different thing than any other vitamin. Some people think it shouldn't even be classified as a vitamin because it does so many great things. And it's so necessary. And humans have been outside forever, right? We've been getting sun. We've been, not powered by, but we're fed like good things that our body needs by the sun. And when you take that away from people, it messes them up, right? It's kind of like taking the humans out of the environment, giving them different food. It's like instead of roaming the plains and eating animals, you shove us in a city, in a building, and give us cereal and Pop Tarts and these fake foods. Of course, things go wrong. So if we're not out in the sun like we're used to, things start to go wrong. And there's tons of good data showing how beneficial sunlight is and how everyone knows you get vitamin D from sunlight, and that our vitamin D levels are so low these days. And what's interesting is if you look at the people, I posted a couple of these studies on Instagram and Twitter and everything showing the people with the worst outcomes, the very severe cases of COVID and the deaths from the virus have had very, very low vitamin D. And the people who have adequate vitamin D, which is above 30 in our units, I don't know what units you have, but which I think is too low. Most people think you should be around 50. And this is more ancestral. This is what our ancestors had. Some people get up to 90 and stuff, and that they are protected. It's part of your immune system. And we're seeing in all these correlation, these studies. I mean, it's not, it's correlational studies. Like, we can't say 100%, but we can see that the people with the sufficient levels of vitamin D who get the virus are doing okay. And and they have very mild cases. And so I think this is, very expected, because I've been following the whole time, and I'm glad to see these studies coming out, because as soon as I started raising my vitamin D levels, I stopped getting sick. I mean, there's two things. I stopped eating refined grains and sugar. I stopped eating all these carbs and processed foods, and I also started getting more vitamin D and sun, and I don't get sick anymore. I mean, it's been years and years. I mean, I realized in 4 or 5 years, I barely got sick once, and it was only for like a day. And it could have knocked someone else out, but I just was kind of fine. But yeah, I think vitamin D is important, and you should be getting outside and supplementing if you can't get outside.
Brian, what is your opinion on fake meat?
Well, fake meat is a huge problem. I think it's kind of ruining, like, it's hurting our society. It's hurting. There's a message that it's healthier for us and it's healthier for the environment. And on both accounts, I believe that is wrong. That they'll try to massage the numbers and do some fancy calculations and try to make it seem like it's better than meat for the environment. But really, it's just because they use these very wrong, false calculations to get meat and the impact on the environment in the first place, right? An example is they use all the rainwater that falls on the ground and they count that as water use for cows, right? So it's like, oh, well, this pound of beef took, 2 million gallons of water. I'm like, okay, well, most of that was from the rain. So they can do calculations like that. So when you do those bogus calculations, then it can make it seem like these fake foods are better for the environment, but they're not. But and then the health side is probably pretty obvious to people, maybe, where you just look at the ingredients. A lot of people have been posting about the ingredient list. It's like beef has one ingredient, and these fake burgers have 30 something ingredients, and that they have highly processed and refined grains. And so I don't think anyone should be eating fake modern foods and thinking that they're healthier than foods we've been eating forever.
Brian, what do you say to the people who say that we need to be doctors to change our health?
Do we need doctors? So, yeah, I mean, I think you're a great example of, some people can take things into their own hands, right? And that, like, either you don't need to necessarily listen to every doctor, because most doctors I've found aren't well versed in nutrition. They're not up to date. They don't know all this new stuff that I know. I'm not saying I'm smarter than a doctor, but I'm saying that I've exposed myself to better research, and I can point them to studies. I can point them to good science to prove them wrong. And it's just the problem is most of these doctors don't see this. So I think I like to take people's opinion. They don't have to be a doctor. I like guys, there's engineers. There's guys like Ivor Cummins or like Dave Feldman that study cholesterol, and I'll take their opinion on cholesterol before a doctor. And so, yeah, I mean, it's about trying stuff for yourself. And, maybe you have to get a new doctor. Maybe you have to not listen to them if you have, the correct information.
Brian, many people in the world are moving towards veganism by watching movies like Game Changers. What do you say about that?
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I made a whole movie debunking the Game Changers film. So I did it in just a few weeks, but you can look it up on YouTube. It's called Game Changers Debunked. And we just threw it together. We had a little fun with it. There's one version where we did some comedy, and there's another version that doesn't have that comedy if you don't care for that. But it I think it's really harmful. I think it can be helpful in a way if you think about the fact that they're trying to get people to focus on health, right? Which is good. And I think more people need to focus on that because so many people are just going about life and they don't care and they just go to fast food restaurants. And they're trying to advocate for whole foods, I think. Maybe not all the time because they're talking about, actually James Cameron, the producer, the millionaire producer, has a huge investment in pea protein, right? So he's like trying to get people to eat more, these pea protein products. There's a lot to gain from people going vegan because it's one of the only good ways to get a lot of protein. So, I mean, I'm conflicted. I don't want to be 100%, negative about it, but I think they are confusing the public. Other than the message of eating whole foods and focusing on your health, everything else is wrong, and that it's I'm not a fan of this film. So like, there's where they're confusing the public, right? It's like if they're saying that meat is bad and that they have no good evidence, they have fake science, and I could disprove all of that. So I think it's just confusing people.
Brian, you said that we are glorifying being overweight. What do you mean by that?
So here in America, at least, a lot on the news, people are trying to say it's this body acceptance movement, fat acceptance movement. It's that you're great at any size and it's perfectly healthy to be overweight. That's just how you are, and that everyone should be accepting of you. And it's a good message in that we don't want to make fun of people, and it's a good message for people to be confident in themselves and not feel bad about themselves. But it's a terrible message otherwise. It's a terrible message that it's very clear that science is very, very clear that if you are overweight, you are not as healthy. This is not like a fringe science. This is well known. You have way more risk of death. You have way more chronic disease. You have way more type 2 diabetes and many other problems. So I don't understand why we're promoting people to be unhealthy. We know this. So I just think it's a dangerous message, and I want to work to kind of stop this and just let people know that this is not how you are, right? It's kind of this idea that you are overweight because that's how you are. This is your DNA, or this is how you're born. And guys like you are proving it. It's like you lost all this weight. This is not how you are. You just have the wrong information, right? You just have the wrong information, of course. So I read these articles. They're like, this woman is gigantic, 500-pound woman. And she's like, I just can't lose weight. I'm eating low fat yogurt and crackers and cereal. And I'm like, of course you can't lose weight. That stuff is horrible for you, and then I'm sure she's trying to, starve herself and eat those little tiny like low fat yogurts, and then she'll have to binge and eat more later, right? I mean, so it's a terrible message. If people understood they could just eat some meat, they would be full, they could be healthy, they could change their life. I mean, I know tons of people. I know a great woman, Laura Spath. If anyone wants to check out on Instagram, she lost half her body doing a carnivore diet. She was 280 pounds. 1 year later, she was 140 pounds. And, she's a personal friend of mine. I know her. I know how it's, all about how it's worked for her and how successful she is, and how it's very simple, and how she gets her family. Her husband has a similar story, and I don't know. I think it's great.
When you say to do the workouts to failure, can you explain that?
Yeah. I think jogging and all this endless cardio that people have said was what we should do is kind of bad information. That I think we need to eat densely and move intensely. That's my little tagline. Instead of eat less, move more. That doesn't really tell you anything, and I think that's bad advice, and it hasn't worked, and we've been saying it for decades. But what you should do is eat densely and move intensely. So eat densely is nutrient dense foods. So that's all the animal foods and, maybe some key plant foods. And then move intensely means you do intense exercise. You lift weights, you sprint, stuff like that. That tells your body to get stronger. It tells your body to get faster. It's what our ancestors did. We also did some slow, steady state. I mean, yes, we could walk for long distances or travel long distances. So I have no problem with that. And I think that's great, to also do. Like I go on long walks a lot these days. I go for 5 mile walks all the time because we're locked down here and there's not much else to do. I think that's fine. But I don't think you need to, people think that they have to do 45 minutes on the treadmill to be healthy. And I think that's a very inefficient kind of non-ideal way to to work out. I mean, as an engineer, I look, you want to be effective and efficient, and that's not it. You can sprint for 10 minutes, maybe just do 10 1-minute sprints and you'll be done instead of doing this slow, steady state cardio that I think makes people even gain weight. You see people who do like jogging or they do marathons and they're like they could gain weight because and they're carbo loading and they're thinking they need like Gatorade and pasta. So I think it's a bad idea. Just lift some weights, do some push-ups, do some pull-ups, do some squats. I mean, you can do it without even any equipment.
Brian, why do institutions like WHO still promoting the usage of vegetable oils and are against meat?
Well, I interviewed a scientist, Dr. David Klurfeld, who was on the WHO panel that decided meat was a carcinogen in 2015. And he was on that panel and he said they were all a bunch of vegan, vegetarian people that were against meat. So he started proving, and he was for it. He was saying he said they were ignoring studies that he brought to the table, saying no, meat does not cause cancer, and they were ignoring it. So there's just these heavy biases in these type of organizations that for years people have been thinking that meat is bad for the environment and that's been bad for people. So there is entrenched beliefs, you could call it, right? This is how people raised it in, there's the hippie movement, in the 60s and 70s, people know the hippies and they're all like, you can't eat meat, man, you can't eat meat. Like these are the people that grew up in this environment and they still believe it. And they're not looking at the new research. And they're a lot of times they're even confusing nutrition research with environmental stuff, right? So that they when we were talking about nutrition, we need to talk about nutrition. We can't, even if you do think that cows are bad for the environment, you can't let that into the discussion on nutrition. So a lot of times that happens, right? So they have this idea that meat's bad for the environment. So like, okay, how can we, eat these other foods that are supposedly better for us and make them healthy? And they're like, oh, if you just eat, if you count your calories, then you can eat all these sugars and grains and you can be fine. But it never works. So that's a big problem with these big organizations, and I don't know how we're gonna change that. I mean, it's hard.
Brian, Sally K. Norton has a question for you. She's
Okay.
asking, what is your opinion on oxalates and did the peeling of your skin improve?
Yeah, so Sally Norton's great. I was eating a lot of spinach and I was eating big spinach shakes, kale shakes, all these high oxalate foods. And I started following her work and immediately stopped eating them, all that stuff. And I immediately my fingers started peeling. So it was called this oxalate dumping, and I had all these symptoms of oxalate problems, and they were leaving my body. And so I really haven't eaten any oxalate foods in over a year now. So it's been a full year, and I think that it's been great. And I don't think I've missed out on anything. I don't eat spinach anymore, but I don't. My health has not changed. My health's probably gotten better. So uh, it's funny. The only other time my fingers peeled there was one time when I was with a certain it's kind of celebrity chef type of guy, and we went to this nice restaurant, and we're like, oh, I got some Brussels sprouts and some kale and some salmon, and the next day my fingers peeled again. It was really interesting. It's like maybe it was 2 days later. It was my fingers have never peeled since, and it happened. So I think oxalates, there's really something to it, and you should maybe try taking a break from high oxalate foods and see how you feel.
Thanks, Brian. Brian, now we have questions from our subscribers.
Hmm.
Frank is asking, what are the top three food myths that people believe?
Top three. Oh wait, meat is bad is number one. I think that's the biggest food myth that people need to get out of their head. And I could tell you, 100 reasons why that's untrue and why we started thinking that. So just get that out of your head. Meat is not bad. I think number two is sort of the opposite, that plants are magical, right? I think that that is a big food myth that people, I think really what plants, I'm thinking they're kind of neutral. That why people who eat more plants do better or they get healthier is because they're replacing junk food with more plants, right? So it's more about what you're avoiding or what these plant foods are replacing. And because I mean, there's a huge carnivore community removing all plant foods and everyone's doing fine, right? They're realizing, wait, I'm not eating any plants and I feel great. So they're not magical. I think they're just neutral. I think they're survival foods. And then I think the last one, the big food myth, oh man, it's hard. Maybe fat. I think that fat is bad is another huge one. So many people are still afraid of fat, and it's to this day. I thought people are like understanding it more because keto diets are getting popular. People still don't get it. I meet everyone. I'm in Los Angeles. There's a lot of these vegan, plant-based people here, and so many people I meet, they're just like they're scared of fat. So don't be scared of fat.
When Justin is asking that many health experts are suggesting different types of diets. So, how to find that truth?
Mm. Yeah, well, like I said, the Sapien framework, I'd say if you find your spot in the Sapien framework, right? This is my all the years I've looked at this and combining all the information and Weston Price and studies and this and that is you have to find what works for you within that framework, right? And then so there is no one magical diet, but it's a diet of whole foods and it's a diet that doesn't have vegetable oils and sugars and refined grains and the rest is kind of up to you, right? So I don't think it's a very controversial thing to say this is the correct way to eat because you're eating whole foods. You can do your own ratio of plant to animal foods. Some people might prefer more plant foods. That's fine. Some people want more animal foods. Basically, if you're just eating whole foods and avoiding the three bad things, then that is the truth.
Katie is asking how to answer vegans who are arguing that killing animals is unethical.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I mean, that's kind of the last little bit that is hard to disprove, right? Because I can disprove claims about the environment and the atmosphere and the land and the water, but the last thing is basically just a ethical choice that people want to make. Some people don't want to choose to eat an animal, but the fact that we made up ethics for one thing. This is a recent thing. For all of history, there was no ethical argument against killing an animal, and I don't see why there would. This is how humans survived and evolved, and it's part of our life and culture, and it got us here today. So we wouldn't be around if we didn't eat animals. So I think that that's one thing. Another thing is that there's so many more animals that die raising crops and growing all these plant foods that people don't know about or people don't want to know about. So just because you say I'm not purposefully eating an animal doesn't mean animals didn't die for you to get your food. People know about when they harvest all these grains and they have these giant combines and all these animals get chopped up in that. But even more than that, the animals they get killed by pesticides. The animals get killed by displacement, where we're clearing all the land for these monocropped fields. They get poisoned in the waterways from the fertilizer. There's so many ways that animals die that from growing crops. So really the best way, the most ethical way to eat, in my opinion, is to eat a grass-fed, grass-finished, ethically raised cow or other animal that lives in nature, it lives in its natural environment and is not fed, any kind of monocrops. Because some animals they're fed these these corn, wheat, and soy. But it's actually not. Well, there's a misconception there too. It's not like they're just getting fed corn, wheat, and soy that humans would have eaten. They're eating byproducts. They're eating leftovers, right? So a lot of these calculations are wrong when they're like, oh well, people, the anti-meat people will say, oh well, you're eating factory farm meat and they're eating a bunch of corn. I'm like, no, and it had to be grown in monocrops. I'm like, for one thing, I would rather eat regeneratively grown, grass finished meat. And second thing is that they eat stuff that has been already used or leftovers. So really, the most ethical way to eat is, you can eat a few animals. You can only kill a few animals a year. If you live by a farm, you can get, some animals, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be beef, but you can get it from a local farmer that has grown it themselves, and less animals will die that way.
Brian, would you like to issue a 7-day challenge to our viewers?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, what to do? 7-day challenge. Okay, this could be a hard one, and I don't even know. I'm not even good at this one, but I'd say to not eat a single processed food, not eat one food that has sugars, refined grains, or vegetable oils for 1 week. So sometimes, like people I send me like products like keto products. Actually, they don't have sugars, refined grains, or vegetable oils. They actually have, they use almond flour and stuff like that. But anyway, I'd say go to challenge. It's kind of like Whole 30, right? People have heard of Whole 30. It's like you just eat whole foods for 30 days. So basically, let's try to do it for a week. Whole foods only, Let's try it.
Thanks, Brian. Brian, can you say once again where to connect with you so that they will remember it better?
Yeah, so sapien.org. You can find everything from sapien.org, and then also just Food Lies. Just search for Food Lies on any social media.
Thanks, Brian. Guys, go and pre-order Food Lies documentary and put a full stop to health misinformation. Thank you, Brian, for coming to the show again.
Sure, thanks so much. Hey everyone, subscribe to BNS Goku Great.